Welcome to another in-depth webinar. Today, we kind of kick off a series on finance and investments, on funding what we're building in Ag Data Commons and the work that many of you are doing in your organizations. So today we have Nick Honegger, second time appearance, but this time wearing a hat as an associate for the Soilworks Natural Capital. He's also the general manager of PassionMap. Soilworks Natural Capital is devoted to expanding the regenerative ag economy, and their mission is to invest in, incubate, and acquire assets to help accelerate regenerative farming practices, as well as drive consumer awareness and demand for regenerative products. So there's really no question why he's here today. So we'll have the next hour, about half an hour to maybe 40 minutes of presenting or less. And the rest will be devoted to your questions. So with that, Nick, I'll toss it to you.
Awesome. I will get my screen all ready to go. Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me back. It's always fun kind of hang out and talking. Can everybody see this? Thumbs up? All right, great. Well, hello again. I'm Nick Honegger, so I'm the GM at PastureMap, but the other hat I get to wear is an associate at Soilworks Natural Capital. So I know with funding talks, it's always kind of a double-edged sword, in my opinion, where it's hey, we're interested about the fund and where it came from, but also two, everyone is always fundraising, I feel like, whether it's your storytelling or kind of trying to figure out how to finance new ideas. So I built in a bit more extra time today to go through questions from anything if you're curious about what we've seen as a portfolio, or kind of what you can do if you're kind of seeking funding, or what helps you stand out, and kind of can go from there. But I figured I'd start off with Soilworks and talk about exactly who we are and why we came about. So we have two phenomenal founders, Ed Byrne and Lou Mormon, who actually started a tech fund here in San Antonio, Texas, called Scaleworks. It was about a $90 million kind of B2B SaaS fund that was very successful. And they said, we're very good at scaling companies. How do we kind of go help save the planet as well, if you will? And Lou actually had a ranch at the time, and Ed was pretty invested in regenerative agriculture in terms of just from an interest point of view. And it's kind of spawned into this idea of Soilworks, where we said, the mission is to accelerate the transition to regenerative agriculture, and really kind of break that down into the logistics between farmer and consumer, and new consumer brands that need to be created, opened, an entirely new massive market opportunity for business creation. So we're like, okay, how do we kind of go about that? We thought we could take our same portfolio approach that we did with some of the other funds we were involved in, but heavily partner with those who have the kind of know-how about regenerative on top of our kind of ability to scale companies. And thus kind of Soilworks came about. So our kind of main focus in life is to accelerate the transition to regenerative ag. We break this out into three categories, right? It's creating consumer demand and building a supply chain to fulfill it. And this is kind of how that looks as a whole. So we see it as all very interconnected. So anything that we either add to the portfolio or are evaluating has to kind of be in one of the self-fulfilling triangle, if you will, right? Like, we are big believers in consumer brands are going to drive the move to regenerative agriculture. And the reason we say that is, we've seen some really awesome tools out there for ranchers. We've seen some really great innovations from just making the land and the world a better place. But the reality is, be it good or bad, if consumers are not willing to pay a premium or demand those types of products from producers, or pay extra to support that, it's not going to be able to sustain itself, right? Like, you have to have consumers that are excited that their beef, for example, is regenerative and know what that means, and kind of willing to pay that markup. So we think it's our job as a portfolio to say we actually have to help develop those consumer brands, and also reinforce the educational material going out that help people realize why regenerative is better for the planet, and why they should make those kind of decisions as consumers to prefer those brands versus other products, if you will. So that, what I would say, is one of our pillars. The other one is new tools and software for farmers and ranchers. So PastureMap, which is kind of my main hat, if you will, would fall into this bucket. So we are actively looking for things that actually make, being a regenerative rancher easier. Might be the the wrong word, because we all know it's not an easy process, but I would say just, empower them to, hopefully make their decisions easier, or at least, get more out of their land. And the last pillar to that, which is one that we are very interested in cracking, but I'll just be open about, this is, I think, one of the challenging areas that we're trying to approach is the supply chains themselves. I think the silver lining of COVID, if I could pick one, would be it really showed both consumers and kind of the market how vulnerable our processing is, and things like with Tyson and some of the meat processors, where production kind of stopped for a little bit, and it was just very interesting how the supply chain can kind of come to a halt when a lot of things were shaken out. So we're looking for just ways to make that easier on specifically smaller regenerative operations, and scale that out. And that one, I know I don't have a magic answer yet. We have yet to make an acquisition in that space. We're super eager, and think that's going to be a key piece of this journey to make regenerative kind of really dominant in the industry. So that boiled down to some beliefs on our side, right? So we think what's super important, right, is regenerative agriculture is one of the core solutions to climate and food crisis. So Soilworks is actually a Court B, so we don't only measure ROI in monetary returns to our investors. We are very focused on, we're going to make investments that might be a slower return, or slow money, if you will, in exchange for, hey, this actually has a big impact on things like carbon sequester, or hey, this can make a big impact in food delivery, which helps with that impact, which is great. I think it means we look and are very selective about who we're raising money from, and set those expectations up front. Truth be told, that makes us different than some of the other funds in the market, where if you just want a giant check, we're probably not the best partner for you, in that sense, that we are very mission driven. We want to be involved in a little more in the day-to-day than probably your average fund. But I think that's what kind of makes us exciting, is that if you're looking for partners that are excited about actually making this mission happen, it's very, very much in our wheelhouse. So the long-term view is that we think regenerative agriculture can absolutely scale, and we want to provide the resources to do that. And we want it to be, and we think it's going to be, a large industry over the next decade or two. I think you see big innovations in this now, with like some of the research that Cargill's doing over in Iowa, and some of their other test farms that are scattered around, where oddly enough, I think it's going to work kind of like Tesla did with electric cars, and where no one bought Teslas because they were saving the planet. They bought them because they were sports cars, and it happened to save the planet too. I think regenerative might end up in that world, where you see these big producers that can say, hey, if it turns out that my regenerative operation can be more cost effective and produce a higher quality product that I can get better margins on, that's an incentive for me to switch. And it just so happens that it saves the planet. And regardless of whether or not that's good or bad, I'm excited about the fact that you've got people like us who are super excited to be helping grow an environment that is going to do a lot for food quality and food health and a whole bunch of other things, as I'm sure everyone on this call knows. But at the same time, you see these very large kind of industrial producers saying, hey, if this actually solves my bottom line issue as well, it's getting a lot more investment money into the space, which I think is just a net positive overall. So our business approach to this is, we're looking for profitable, high growth businesses that need to be created to make this shift happen. So what this means, if you look across the Soilworks portfolio, is a lot of our investments are in smaller companies or brand new brands that we're helping create to kind of help fuel the growth into the regenerative space. And then I'll probably say this one a couple of times, because I really think it's a core tenet that often gets overlooked, is actually driving the consumer awareness. So when we talk about kind of things like supply and demand and kind of driving that market force, if consumers aren't willing to go to their grocery store and pick up the regenerative product versus something else, it doesn't matter how much capital or resources are poured into the kind of regenerative ecosystem. At the end of the day, if that doesn't sell any better or at a premium to incentivize the actual producers, it will die out. So I'm super confident that it's not going to happen, but I think it needs kind of funds like us and other people that are believing this movement to say, look, we have to create and educate consumers on why regenerative is super important, which is why with things like Kiss the Ground coming out, like that is the kind of more content we need to kind of help fund as a community to say, no, here's why regenerative is better. Or here's what it can at least do for the planet, and why, if you're a consumer, you should at least evaluate that when making the switch. And some of our core principles that we look at when we're evaluating either opportunities that come to us or when we're just kind of looking at the market as a whole is that we want you to check kind of some of these boxes, right? So are you making better and healthier food? Are you restoring plant and animal diversity? Are you generating soil to store water and carbon better? Are you making more profitable family farms? And the reason we have this last one, which is my favorite, again, selfishly because of my involvement in PastureMap, where we're very kind of focused on small ranchers. I mean, ranchers in general, is there's an interesting dichotomy with, I think, rancher technologies where some of them are designed for these very large scale operations, and it makes them like X% more efficient, which is fine. But I think what's getting overlooked sometimes is, you know, a large percentage of ranches are going to change hand over the next 5 to 10 years. And there's kind of this interesting moment where those are either going to get passed on to a younger generation or get bought up by larger groups. And I'm not saying one is better than the other, but I think what we should have is the ability to where if I want to pass on my ranch to, you know, my son or my children or what have you, it should be profitable, and there should be ways and resources where if I'm, you know, running my ranch correctly, it can be a business. It doesn't all have to be this very large manufactured ecosystem. And one thing that we're finding, and which is great with our fund, is if we empower ranchers to do things like start and become regenerative and take advantage of things like carbon markets and other kind of new revenue streams and opportunities, it does great for two reasons. One, it means we get a lot more, you know, small profitable ranches that can grow and kind of scale a regenerative as a whole. And two, if the ranchers are more profitable, then suddenly adopting software tools or things that we're kind of growing in the portfolio become more feasible for them to do. So I think we're incentivized to help producers, because if we can make their kind of ROI on regenerative better, then suddenly them affording tools or software enhancements go hand in hand. So I like to say it's the regenerative model, right? Where everyone kind of wins, where consumers are winning because they're getting better products overall, producers are winning because they're getting a lot more revenue, and then us as a portfolio can win because, look, if we truly built that ecosystem, the extra $5 to $10 here and there to actually support more tools for the rancher becomes significantly more affordable, and we get out of kind of acquiring debt to produce kind of mindset. So our leading indicator of success, and I kind of threw this on its own slide because this is kind of why Soilworks, I would say, is special and a bit different in general, is that I would say typical funds are ROI is, you know, cash coming in. Like, what is our turnaround? What did we buy and sell X for? But our leading indicator of success is how many regenerative acres we have created as a fund, which I think makes us stand out. That's why we're an interesting partner. Our big goal is to say, look, can we actually empower ranchers to be regenerative and have that be the metric of success at a fund level? So obviously we have to keep the doors open. We can't just burn capital all day, but we are much more focused on the actual creation of regenerative acres versus anything else. And we kind of pick and choose our partners and our acquisitions because of this. All right, so I've kind of given you the model of how scale works, why scale works, or soil works, sorry. So let's talk about what we've done so far, and I'll tell you a little bit about each portfolio company. I'm not going to dive super in depth into either of them, just because if you're more curious about PassionMap, there's a great recording that OpenTEAM already has posted that you can go watch. And Wholesome is a bit more self-explanatory because it's a consumer brand. So we started the fund about 6 or 7 months ago. Soilworks kind of came to existence with the acquisition of PassionMap. So my favorite story about this is Lou, one of our GPs, was actually a PassionMap customer, which is how we found it. So we are kind of walking in the shoes of ranchers, if you will. We do know what's going on with technology and why it worked out. We were super excited as that is a tool set. And Wholesome Meats is a kind of brand we launched internally, so it was not acquired. It was something that we kind of created through some of our producers that we had known and had relationships with, and also met through PassionMap. and that is a regenerative beef brand. And we've got some kind of new things coming on the horizon that are a lot more focused on that consumer level brand. They're not announced yet, so bear with me with some secrecy, but in the coming month or so, we're going to have some really exciting stuff at the consumer level on just kind of educational resources about regenerative as a whole. So quick overview of what PassionMap is. If you've never heard of it before, it's grazing management simplified. It's kind of our tagline of what I like to call it, but it is your one-stop shop for all data related to grazing management. So anything from tracking your herds to your rotations to photo logs to show how your land is changing. I like to think of it as your way to validate that you're a rotational and regenerative rancher. And at the same time, you have all the data at your fingertips to kind of predict and get the most out of your pastures. So we've had ranchers plug in their data and suddenly realize they can have an extra $100,000 in stocking rate capacity because they weren't maximizing their forage well. And to me, that is the biggest win possible, right? Is that we can actually put tools out into the marketplace that ranchers have an immediate impact around for, hey, not only if I use this, do I get better data, but I have a significant increase in potential revenue just from having time to look at that data. And the reason why this was exciting to us at a portfolio is for a number of reasons, but one of the kind of data points that always stick out in my mind is if you look across the board at all regenerative ranchers and ranching in general, 7.3% of ranchers have a grazing management plan, which means almost more than 90% of active ranchers have no written or documented plan for grazing, which is wild in my mind. So we could literally kind of change the face of an industry by simply getting people to document what they're doing on a ranch. And the big value here is A, we can then validate the efforts of regenerative ranching. I think one thing that not a lot of people talk about in the industry that needs to be kind of be solved is there's a whole bunch of anecdotal evidence of why regenerative is better. And there's a bunch of studies being done all at the same time, but no one talks about where that data lives or how it's captured. And what I would love to do with PastureMap is have that be a gigantic data warehouse to say, look, we have got thousands of ranchers documenting the rotational habits of all of their herd every day, and look at the positive benefits that's had on the environment, right? If we can just get people to use grazing plants, which is a huge opportunity there and why we're super excited about it. And then our other brand, Wholesome Meats, love our tagline here is our beef heals the planet. It is a regenerative meat company. This one is kind of obvious as to why it was kind of built into the fund, right? It gives a kind of reason for people to pursue and acquire regenerative products. And also, we pride ourselves on it is one of the few regenerative products in the market where if you go into the stores to kind of purchase it, it explains to consumers, and a lot of the packaging is designed to promote why regenerative is important, right? It's not your kind of standard block of meat. It actually has some kind of, depending on kind of where you acquire it from, but it's got a lot of statistics on why regenerative is better and what that means. And it's a small step. By no means is that revolutionary, but I think that's the kind of mindset we have when approaching kind of other options for the portfolio is look, are you really taking to heart the goal to expand and grow regenerative? And like I said, this is maybe more of a Soilworks specific, where we're that kind of focused on not only the product piece, but also the educational piece. But I think to really have the regenerative movement spread and grow, that's going to be critical, which is why we have that kind of within all of our brands. So how do you get involved, right? So a lot of options here, and I'll kind of walk through it and give examples. So if you are curious about what we're up to and want to learn more, or just kind of see how Soilworks is growing toward what we're doing, I would highly suggest to sign up for our newsletter at soilworksnaturalcapital.com. We're also trying to highlight other producers and other regenerative folks out there. So even if you want to sign up and shoot me an email and say, hey, we're doing some really cool stuff, let me know, because we'd love to feature other regenerative providers. And most of our newsletters are actually just kind of a lot of news from around the community that we try and highlight. Because again, I think community growth is critical for be it the fund or just the movement in general. If you are looking for funding or want to talk about like, hey, I've got a great idea, or I'm trying to do more stuff with my operation or my tool, we've got a contact us page that you can essentially say, hey, I'm so-and-so, would love to chat with you about, XYZ, or send us a pitch deck. One of the benefits about Soilworks is because we are a newer fund out there, we are very open to different investment style opportunities. So I'm going to assume this is going to be a question coming up, so I'll try and answer it here is, what investments do we do before you want to kind of reach out, right? So we are kind of very open to all ideas and opportunities, right? So we've done anything from full takeovers to launching our own brands to different size checks, where if you want to kind of sell equity or you name it, we've probably kind of evaluated it, and that's fine. I think the biggest thing that we're focused on, regardless of check size, or if you want to do a full acquisition or what have you, is it pushing the regenerative movement? And if you check yes to that box, we're probably excited to have a conversation with you. Bonus points if it's synergistic with other kind of companies in the portfolio. Again, selfishly putting on my PassionMap hat, we are really looking for people to help us push that validation aspect. So if you've got kind of software tools that kind of build in that data, we're doing a lot of projects with some of the other OpenTEAM members that are doing stuff like this and trying to build out that project. So we are just very focused on, if you're in the regenerative space, we'd love to talk to you as either kind of a helper or putting you in touch with other people, or if you need funding, we'd love to kind of help strategize that, or it could be us. And then partner with other organizations in the fund. So another thing that we're doing, and why we're talking with OpenTEAM, is trying to find more organizations that are doing exciting stuff in this space that might not need funding, but need, say, something like data on ranchers, right? So PassionMap would be that kind of option. So we've talked to some like Nori and Regen Network and other folks that are doing a lot of carbon sequestration work that are members of OpenTEAM, on how we can kind of help them do that validation process. We've been talking to other groups that are doing things that are really cool with automated like water tracking across ranches, where they just need a place for that data to live. They're like, hey, we have this cool technology that can always monitor like how much water your animals have, but ranchers don't want a separate app for something like that, so it needs to go live somewhere. So I think, great, let's partner and figure out ways to get that implemented. So I think that's kind of another interesting option to kind of get involved with the fund, where it's not necessarily monetary resources. It's, hey, I'd love to help the regenerative community. You all seem like-minded. That's kind of other ways we can support people, is how can we partner? How do we, is it educational materials or what have you? We're just super open to kind of helping out and driving it that way. And the other option I will humbly plug is join other regenerative communities like OpenTEAM. Obviously, if you're here, you're a member, which is phenomenal. But I think our kind of biggest metrics of success is, hey, can we help drive and push the regenerative movement? And so for that means like go talk to as many groups as possible. And just know that even if you have a conversation with someone like Soilworks and we don't necessarily invest, or we can't make a partnership work right away, there's a ton of other organizations based off your size and kind of how you're trying to scale. And the reason I added this piece is one, I think it's just important to go meet as many people as you can to help make this regenerative movement work. And two, there's a whole bunch of new founders out there that have kind of found their way in the regenerative world and will go, start the pitching process for capital and trying to do a raise. And it's a hard process to do. And I've walked that road before, and you get told no a whole bunch of times. And I think it can be discouraging. And I think the trick is, this is my kind of way to help instill some confidence, where even if you're still trying to find funding, you're trying to make your idea work, there's a ton of different style investment opportunities and a ton of other groups. So even if, say, a Soilworks isn't the right fit, it's okay to ask like who else you should talk to. And I think that's just a really useful piece of advice when you're trying to do any sort of fundraising is, hey, if I'm not a good fit, have you met anyone do you think would be interesting in this opportunity? Because I know for me, I've made at least 3 or 4 of those connections since we've started doing kind of open pitches at Soilworks to say, hey, we're probably not a good fit for this for XYZ, but here's 2 people that I've met through other kind of group networking sessions or other organizations that would probably want to hear about your idea. So anywho, I just think that's a good thing to note, is just because you get told no a couple of times, don't stop fundraising. There's a whole bunch of groups out there, especially now with a lot of the kind of additional movements toward regenerative and the bigger organizations getting involved. That just means, the bright side to all of that is there's more capital in play now, which is great. So that's Soilworks. I've tried to do kind of a rapid fire 30-minute or so session there, because I find typically with kind of fun questions and going through these is that there's a lot more questions on, okay, here's my concept, how do I get funding, or what have you seen, versus just, tell me about the fund in general. So I will happily kind of go back or tell you more about what we've been up to if y'all have questions there. But my hunch is when it comes to funding, most people have questions about that process versus wanting to learn more about me in particular, or what we've been doing. So happy to go into more depth, but would love to open up to questions to see if I can help anybody out.
Thanks, Nick. That's a great kickoff to this series. I'm letting folks take a moment to pull their thoughts together. But while they're doing that, I wonder if you might talk a little bit about whether I think in the next phase, we're going to talk a bit about sort of blended finance and looking at combinations of both, project, equity, and philanthropic sort of funding sources, especially in regenerative, because there are some pieces that are fit better. And, there's some really interesting business structures and motivations and sort of capital needs in terms of the flow. So you might say a little bit about what you've done or how you're thinking about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So one thing that we have looked at and are honestly in the process of applying for PassionMap, I'll use that as an example, is the USDA has a variety of grant programs. One I would plug that we're super intrigued at looking at it is the CIG grant, which is their kind of innovation category. And it's a pretty substantial amount of money depending on what you apply for, and it's specifically designed. It's kind of themed each year, so I don't think the details of the next one have been announced yet. But it's typically to support kind of newer and more innovative ideas in the space of agriculture. So if you're 9 times out of 10, if you're in the regenerative space doing something kind of new and exciting, you kind of, I don't want to say qualify, but you could meet the application status. And I would highly suggest looking there, and they've got some other grant resources that are super useful. And that's kind of where our team is looking internally. So I can very much recommend that one. And there's also a lot of state kind of localized level grants and funding opportunities I would look at. Like the best part about grants, and while I'll kind of harp on those, is it's free money essentially, which is it's a much better return than taking on debt or losing equity. The downside, though, is that it takes time, and it is science. Grant writing is not easy at all. If anyone has ever written grants before, you will know it's very timely. It's a lot of times you end up having to get your own grant writers. But I would say if you've got the time and the bandwidth, I would look there and just know it's a long shot probably for anyone applying. But if you get it, it's going to be the best return in a sense, because you don't owe anybody anything at the end of the day. Other things that we found and kind of explored is, when you're doing any sort of equity trade, if you will, like, hey, we'll give you X% for X dollars. Like you can shop that around in a sense, not publicly of like, oh, well, Soilworks said we could get X for X, but know your valuation and know why you got that. I would say one thing that is super important, especially if you're going to approach a fund and ask for money, is that if you have a valuation, you should be able to know exactly why you are valued at that amount. Or you should have your financials in check. You should say, we've got this many customers, this much revenue coming in, the revenue is recurring. So, we're at like a 5X of our ongoing revenue. The reason we think we're worth 5X is because of X, Y, Z. You would be shocked at how many people come and ask us for capital, and we say, okay, great, let's see your financials. And they don't even have them put together, which is like an instant gigantic red flag, because if you don't have your financials together, then your valuation's just made up. It's just like, hey, we're worth $10 million because I saw Indigo Ag raised $1 billion. So, we must be worth something. And I say that kind of jokingly, but that happens a lot more than you'd think. If you want to do any sort of kind of equity exchange, please take the time to just get your financials in order. Or if you're looking for angel and you don't have financials yet, like there's no revenue, you're a pre-revenue, you just need some seed to get started. Do you have beta customers? Do you have something to show movement? Like you just want to be able to justify what you're looking for. and do that work ahead of time, because it will just make the conversations so much more streamlined. If you can say, well, we're pre-revenue, but we've got 400 users signed up to this beta, and we're going to go test X, Y, and Z. Like, just have the story around it. I think the biggest part of fundraising that people don't realize is a lot of it's just as much of storytelling as it is your idea, right? You have to convince people that you've never met, and now it's over Zoom, right? Which is a whole nother kicker. It's just like, hey, here's why we're going to go change the planet. And I've got X many signups. We're doing this and that, and just know that story and practice that, and know it's okay to share that. And just, this is more rambly, but it is so critical, I think, to get that story across. Because if you could have the best idea on the planet, but if you can't talk about it, no one will fund it. Essentially, like, no one's going to do the work for you and read through your 100-page slide deck that you made and it's perfect, because if you can't convince them to read it, it's not going to do anything for you. So just, I would say, really know your story if you're doing the equity route. And then just to touch on the final piece of that, which is like your classical kind of bank loan, if you will, or debt financing. I think it's like any loan, right? It's if you can pay it off, and it's great, because then you don't lose any sort of equity. It's riskier though, because if you can't pay it off, you've got a huge debt bill that you have to figure out how to deal with. And depending on how much you mean, a lot of people can't go out and get a couple $100,000 on a loan, especially if it's their first project. So if you can do it and pay it off, just like grants, it's probably better to not lose any equity in terms of strictly capital. My only caveat to that is, sometimes when you're doing fundraising, it's not just the money you want. You actually want partners in the space and connections, and those are extremely valuable. And know that a lot of the times when you go raise money, depending on who you're getting capital from, they'll tell you that, and it's not all made up just to kind of screw you out of a percentage or so of your company. It's because, hey, look, if I can instantly plug you into a network of 100 people, or share a user base, or like how you synergize with other portfolio companies, like, that is worth something, right? And I think a lot of people are so obsessed with, it's like the Shark Tank mentality of, it's X dollars or X percent, and that's it. It's like, well, there's a whole bunch of other things that come along with partnerships and connections. And if you want, and I'll give Soilworks as an example, if you want a gigantic check and someone that never talks to you, you just want the capital, we're a terrible fit. Like, we would never be a good funding partner for you, because we want to be involved and we'll probably ask questions and want to have you synergize with our portfolio companies. So if you want someone way more hands-on, but probably a less overhaul initial investment, and that's great. That's perfect. But it's just very much, you should sit down with your team and have the discussion of, okay, this is what we need. And is it capital? Is it, teamwork? Is it more people? Is it expertise? And know that beforehand, because you can find a whole bunch of people that will just give you a check of different amounts. And I think you have to be able to evaluate, check size versus partnerships versus a whole bunch of other things. And the more you do beforehand and just kind of talk that out with your founders, it's way easier when it comes to kind of signing on the dotted line, because you'll have had all the hard discussions beforehand, hopefully.
Great. I wonder, again, while waiting for others here, if you might talk a little bit about your approaches with, in models for financing, where so much of this requires data sharing and interoperability for the OpenTEAM community, where we're really working towards business models that are both, that support regenerative agriculture and are sustainable, but also are contributing to, and using a lot of, and to be functional to use open source tools and technology. So maybe a little bit about sort of how your fund is approaching intellectual property as part of that valuation, as, in that, and how you're thinking about that. I know we've had some of these conversations already. But.
Yeah, so I don't know if we're unique or not to this, but I think because we come from a tech background, we've kind of grew up in a world prior to the regenerative agriculture kind of fund, where open source is just a part of life, where it's with like things like the Linux Foundation and like GitHub. There's a million big tech companies that thrive on, part of our IP is open sourced, and that's really important for XYZ, and part of the very secret stuff is locked away. And that's very much our same mindset and how we approach IP. That's the reason why PassionMap is saying like, look, let's write APIs and share data and figure out how to get more ranchers into the system. Because I think the trick and how I kind of, this, it may be more me, but how I view open source and why it's useful is it allows you to have access to a whole bunch more data that you were never going to get anyway, right? So I think there's this weird concept of, oh, if I could get so many patents, I can just outwork 100 other teams just trying to solve the same problem. And then the reality is, figure out what you're really good at and don't share that. That is your thing. And then go find partners who can benefit from that information, and what can you share and work on together that benefit both of you, because that only makes the valuation of both groups higher. And I know that's a bit of a vague answer, but with open source, it's hard to kind of pinpoint it unless you can kind of show examples, right? But a good example of this that we're doing right now, just to kind of quantify this a little more, is like at PassionMap, we are really, really excited about getting a ton of users onto the platform to capture their data, right? Because we think that data is going to be, usable at some point, be it through standards or sequestering carbon or what have you. What we don't want to do is build a carbon marketplace, right? That is, we're not going to try and solve that. That seems super hard. There are a ton of awesome teams doing that right now. So that is where we say, okay, like who's doing this? An OpenTEAM or other kind of open source environments where we say, hey, look, I think we have some pieces of your carbon credits equation, and you need some more people to give you credits to sell. How do we work together? And that's where open source is just incredibly valuable, and I think helps from a valuation standpoint too. If you can come to a fund and say, look, here's what we're super great at, here's what our technology does, here's some partners we're leveraging in the community to have some value add for our users that kind of help everybody out, and that's totally fine. And the thing that you obviously want to look for is you can't open source your entire project and then also it's just harder to raise funds that way, right? If you were like, hey, here's what we do, and all of our source code lives online, so anyone can work on it. It's like, well, that's great and that's fine, but you don't own that. So it's harder to raise money with that. I think that the trick is, okay, own what you are super good at, and then figure out fun open source projects that support your community, and also eventually give you some sort of a value add. And you might not be able to sell that or kind of directly benefit from that partnership, but it helps grow your user base. It might help grow the community, which then in turn helps grow your product, right? And all that kind of ties back into how it will impact your valuation. Or does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, no, yeah,
just one, but
yeah, no, exactly. Well, that's what this is all an exploration about, is like, what are those boundaries, and what's core, and what is really actually a benefit in terms of compatibility and interoperability to sort of grow the whole space. So I saw that Steve from Tech Matters had his hand up. So Steve, take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Dorn, and thanks, Nick. Lots of questions. I guess starting with maybe three that are more about sort of the products. Wholesome Meats, is it vertically integrated, or do you have a set of sort of certified suppliers?
So we have both, actually. So we have a kind of an internal ranch that is kind of our test case, if you will. And then we use tools like PastureMap and other kind of certifications to find, like, hey, there's white labeled regenerative meat brands out there that we're using to grow the company faster. So it's a bit of a combination.
Great. For packaging, have you figured out a way to like avoid plastic in packaging meat?
I wish. We are trying. We are trying super hard, and I think it's more so our packaging now is, I would say, more sustainable than like styrofoam, like you see in the grocery store, right? So but it is just anyone who's had to deal with this before will know where I'm coming from. It is very difficult to get around plastic sealing stuff. We are looking into other options. I honestly think that's going to be a next big investment. Whoever can find that, because that's, all over the marketplace. You don't have to be regenerative to want to have like more sustainable packaging. But no, we have not solved that bucket yet. Would love to, though.
Okay. Upcycled foods, does that fit? It's sort of like there's not a new grower of an upcycled food. We're taking byproducts. How does that fit into your investment thesis?
Yeah, so I think it would work. I think at the core, and the way we look at it, which is the pretty simplistic view, is at the end of the day, is this regenerative, or will it help kind of soil health and get more carbon into the ground? And if the answer is yes, then we're probably interested in hearing about it. I think the trick, though, for us, and again, every fund will be different on this, is how does it play back into regenerative? That is our hyper focus, right? We are like very narrowly, kind of, admittedly so, focused on that. So we've had some groups come to us with really cool solutions for organic products that we had to say, sorry, that's super cool, but that's not in our bucket. So I think if they come to us with a really cool solution on how it ties back to the regenerative movement, I'd say we'd evaluate it for sure. In terms of what we have now, there's nothing like that currently in the portfolio, but we're definitely open to anything that kind of fits that mold.
And maybe riffing off that, when you talk several times about higher quality products, and I'm hearing more nutritional. Are there other aspects of higher quality?
Let me answer this two ways. So probably yes. It's like just an on-base answer to that. I would say in terms of like the type of food you're growing, or like the cuts of meat and things like that, there's just there's quality can scale that way. I think the way that we kind of bucket quality, and the reason it's on our beliefs, is that we derive that kind of interpretation of the word from some of the statistics and studies coming out on the nutritional density of food that has been dropping over the past kind of while now. So in our mind, when we say quality, it's really about, okay, and I'm gonna butcher the quote. I wish I remembered who said it, but it's like, a carrot is not a carrot is not a carrot, right? And it's this concept of, depending on how you grow stuff, like that to us is really how we're defining quality. Is it when we like have regenerative fruits or vegetables or regenerative meat, it should be better for you, like almost like a food is medicine style of a belief, where it should be packed with nutrition. It should not be just starch or whatever, but it has to actually like provide that wholesomeness, like nutritional value that makes you feel better, in a sense. Does that kind of answer your question? I know it's a weird take on quality, but that's kind of our root for it, is very much around the nutritional content of the food.
Yeah, no, I guess it's about what I expected. I guess the question is continuing to try to find the science and the stuff behind that lets you make claims that you can back up.
No, absolutely. And there's one of my favorite examples of this is, I'm gonna forget the name, but there's a really cool company or like restaurant out of France that actually sells steak, a very particular slice of meat, as medicine because of the omega contents, and it's like graded as medicine, and I think that's where we maybe not inspired us, but like stories like that and studies like that are so intriguing, on that if we can tweak how stuff is grown and really kind of re-densify, I'll make up a word there, the nutrition content in food, I think what that will do for both the planet and the food system could be massive. So super intrigued on that, and trying to figure out more ways to get that done.
So that's, I think, queuing up the RSI folks on the call to maybe for a question along nutrient density measurements and approaches there in the lab. Dan, can I put you on the spot there?
Yeah, no, that definitely caught my ear for sure. Well, just to give you a bit of a background, Nick. So we work with the Real Food Campaign, and we're looking at developing technologies to better predict nutrient density in crops.
Very cool.
An example. So we're both looking at hardware and software ways where we can then either within this food supply chain or like have a consumer facing product that they can use to predict nutrient density and make decisions, purchasing decisions on quality. So they're really not a specific question, just like my ears perked up, and I would love to have more conversation about that with you. That sounds really interesting.
Oh, absolutely. So I do see like how my Zoom savviness is improving since quarantine has started. A type question asking about API connections that PassionMap has today. So I'll tackle that one super quick. So we have an ever improving API is how I will phrase that. So it was originally built out to do. It's like a selfish API originally, where it's like, okay, here's what we need, and here's how we kind of call that in. We are actively building out a much better system for others to do kind of push-pull requests into our system with our kind of data points. We are looking for partners that are interested in our data that we can kind of work together on to improve the API, because if you need data from us, we'd rather have it be automated versus exporting documents or whatever. So it will improve over time. It is one of the top priorities on my radar for the coming kind of year. We've got a few partners, we're solidifying some more, and we just have to have a lot better kind of data flow. So it's not the best yet, but it is getting there for sure.
Great. I was just prompting typing a note there, Nick, to see if Alden might want to jump in here, because we talked a bit about, again, the synergies in data and sort of business models for handing data from a acquisition platform like PassionMap or some of your other portfolio companies, or data that's being collected for other purposes for, say, consumer packaging, and how that may feed into business models like Nori. So maybe I might get, Alden, I wonder if you might jump in with your perspective in terms of, from a business side, how you see some of the structures or innovative approaches to handling financing of that process.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me into the conversation, Dorn. And first of all, we love what Nick and PassionMap are doing. So I've been really enjoying this presentation. You probably asked this question because we struggle with this, and I find Nick's last remarks an interesting segue, because we started off thinking that we were going to be reaching out to, we call them data managers or data managers. And they are entities that are collecting data from food and fiber producers for whatever reason, quite a number of different reasons. And our idea was initially to see what kind of work needed to be done to create on our side that API that Nick described as one where the outsider gets to push and pull from our API. And we've sort of switched into the other direction where we finally, and it's taken us probably too long to get here, where we're settling on trying to firm up our own data spec, and then say to those who want to talk to us and transfer data to us, let's learn what works and doesn't work for you in our spec, and then modify our spec, because we were just finding that we were chasing too many strings, and when we took the first approach, and it's hard. We are definitely resigned to the fact that everybody's going to be talking about the same information using different metrics. We're not going to get everybody to use the same metrics, however much we'd like them to. We spent a lot of time just building what we call our data translation table, which is if data manager A describes this one activity using one set of metrics, and data manager B does it in a different set of metrics, where we accept their different metrics, and we put a lot of time into just the translation table. The translation table is really, really important, because it's not just about how to translate information that's coming into our system and convert it into metrics that we need, given our collaborators. But for example, if you're a carbon market, we're producing draft verification reports for verifiers. Well, that report we make available to a supplier to give to their verifier has to be translated back into the metrics that the outsider used, because if if the verifier has to do the translation, it adds $3,000-4,000 to the farmer's cost of enrollment. So a lot of stuff is not just what's all the data that we need and how much of it do you have and how much do we have to get from elsewhere and how do we get it, but how do we just live with the idea that everybody's talking in different metrics all of the time, and that's just our reality. And yeah, sorry.
Oh, sorry, no, keep going. I didn't mean to cut you up there.
No, and so that's it. So we love what Nick is doing. We love what OpenTEAM is doing. We think of OpenTEAM as a project that's going to be a living entity because I think the challenges I just outlined are not going away. And we've been more productive since we resigned ourselves to that. And I think just, that Bible, which is a translation table, ends up being a way bigger asset than almost anything else, at least for a while.
Yeah. I could not agree more with that sentiment. That's why I was kind of echoing this idea that, because I think that's why we're struggling now, and something we're trying to kind of figure out and improve on is this interesting translation piece between data sources of, PassionMap at its core was, we want to be this data warehouse and kind of be that provider of how do we just get all this stuff into one spot. And interesting enough, it's everybody that we're trying to partner with is even something as simple as, what do you call a herd or cattle, or it's all different, and all that has to be fixed on the back end. And I think that gets looked over a lot when you get pressure from either funders or your team to say, how can this be that hard? Like, all you have to do is, they've got 10 cows in their system, have 10 cows in ours. It's like, well, our system bifurcates those into 4 different options and theirs doesn't. And what do we do? And so interesting challenges that I think, I don't know, just got to answer. And I got one more, I got a whispered question.
We are looking to OpenTEAM to be very serious partners. Both Nick and I are looking.
No, totally agree.
Yeah, we're really excited about getting the PastureMap team into the API switchboard conversation and ontologies work that's coming up over the next couple of months. But yeah, you've got another question there, Nick.
Yeah, I had a question about kind of how our fund operates in terms of when we do an investment like I do with PastureMap, what happens with the resources, if you will, with that team. So I'll give you the PassionMap example. So when we took the company over, there was essentially a sales/everything person who's phenomenal, named CK, who's still with us now. And then they had some other folks on the team. So we brought them in, and since then we've hired about seven folks, and then plugged them into some joint resources we actually have at the fund level. So things like graphic design and like finances and accounting and benefits is all kind of handled by the fund. So I think that's another thing that would probably, you want to consider if you are doing a raise, is what are the kind of external benefits, if you will, aside from capital? Because I know for us, for PassionMap, it instantly enabled, marketing spend. We have still, we quintupled, I guess, the headcount, and we're trying to get more. So which is huge, right? It's how do you expedite projects? How do you get more stuff built? And then what other shared resources can you use, like financing and other projects like that? So again, not every fund has those resources. I think because we did a full takeover, we could instantly kind of plug in and very aggressively grow the team. So that's just kind of something to think about. I think when you're going through the fundraising process is ask about those things where, hey, like, do you have a shared marketing department? Do you have shared graphic designers? Do you have, I've seen shared sales teams at funds before that I've been with before, Soilworks, and you'll be shocked at how often that gets overlooked, because something as simple as, hey, when we moved PassionMap over and we could suddenly hire, 5 new developers and have an office for them in another country so they're more affordable, like, that's massive, right? But that's all kind of, keep that in mind as you're going through fundraising, is what kind of external resources you can leverage, if any, because they definitely exist and are out there and then are extremely helpful in terms of just relationship building, to extra marketing teams, to stuff like, it's great. Yeah, not having to find like a designer who knows your brand all the time, or use freelancers, because you can just email someone internally is very useful.
You're on mute, Dorn.
I was gonna say it has to happen at least once during a during a Zoom call. We have just a couple minutes before the top. Is there a quick question before we sign off? And all right. Thank you so much, Nick, for joining us today and for kicking off this this conversation, which there will be more as we head into the winter months here. And look forward to having you join us for those as we explore some of the structures and different approaches. I believe we have got some folks from the TNC that will be helping to drive that conversation. So we look forward to cross-pollinating not only on the tech, but some of our business structures and finance and so forth too, as we move this community forward. So thanks again. And thank you all for joining us.
Thanks for the invite. And if y'all have any other extra questions or think of anything, feel free to just shoot me an email or I'll be around.
Great.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you all.
Thanks, y'all.
Bye.